Siva, thank you ever so much for making time to talk to me today. For people who don't know you, could you just introduce yourself, just say a few words about who you are and where you work?
Thanks, Fraser. So my name is Siva Nandasiva. I'm the Chief Analyst at the King's Fund, which is a think tank that works in health and social care. I'm a statistician by background, and before working at the King's Fund, I worked for a membership body for NHS trusts and foundation trusts, NHS providers. And a long, long time before that, I worked at the Department of Health, back when it was the Department of Health, not the Department of Health and Social Care.
Thank you. I want to start really broad and draw on the perspectives that you've gained from all of that work history. Why does analysis matter? What are the sort of potential sources of value that we can get from analysis?
So that's a good question. Why does analysis matter? I think particularly in public policy in the fields that I'm involved in, what analysis does is two things. First of all, it gives you better decisions. And secondly, it helps you explain those decisions. And I think the second one is almost as important as the first, to be honest. So in my career, I've seen, if I'm being quite crude, really extreme examples of decision-making. I've seen decision-making that is evidence-free, analysis-free, on gut instinct, informing quite big policy decisions. And I've seen evidence that is absolutely used to drive decisions that determines a course. And actually less variability than you might think. There's less grey area. People seem to take a position. And I just think it's one of those things where if you were to, the word analysis can be really loaded, particularly in health and care policy circles. If you were to take that word out and we talk about logic, who on earth would say, why is logic important in decision making? So there is something quite loaded about this. So I think the first thing is you could get better decisions when you take an analytical approach. You use analysis to inform the decisions you're making. I could give a number of examples, but the one that always springs to mind is something down in Somerset called the Symphony Project, where, like many other health and care systems, this is well known, they were facing challenges of rising demand. And what the Symphony Project did was knit together data from healthcare, from social care, from public health to say, these are the people who are really using our services. And these are the services that we put in place to meet those needs. And it's a pretty bad matchup. And you could start to see in the room the sparks flying as people said, well, if this is what the data is telling us about need, how would we redesign services to better meet that need? And it just catalyzed a complete new approach. So absolutely that first thing, it makes better decisions. The second thing it does is it gives you a basis for explaining why you've done something. And I've just seen people die on stage when they're doing something like a service reconfiguration and a member of the public says, so why are you proposing that you close down this A&E unit? Or why are you proposing that you move stroke services from here to there? And you just see them die on stage because really they haven't got any evidence supporting the position. Contrast that where you have, and I've seen people absolutely soar on stage, a medical director, a nursing director, who says, here are our clinical outcomes under the new model. Here are the clinical outcomes we could provide to you if we were to do things differently. And this is what the data and the evidence is telling us. We're still making the decision, we're still accountable for it, but this is why. So those are my two things. You get better decisions and you can explain why you've made a decision. And those can only be a good thing in my book.
You touched a little, it sounds to me actually like maybe there were two and a half things. You also said, because you were saying you felt like analysis was a loaded term, that there was something, it almost sounded like there was something in the mode of thought that analysts have. Something about the sort of logical mode of thought, something about breaking problems down that would also aid the better decision-making in the way that you were describing it. I'm intrigued about that. So just say a bit more about that. What's in there?
About the loadedness. Well, maybe this is my personal experience, but certainly in the center of government, or as close to the center of government that I managed to get in my career, there was very clearly a hierarchy and a pecking order. You had the policy professionals at the top, and then even within the analytical community, you sort of everyone had to have someone to look down on. So you'd have the economists, who weren't quite as good as policy, but they were a damn sight better than the statisticians. And then you get operational researchers and social researchers. So there was almost this caste system. And you know, partly it was possibly a cultural thing that were adopted, but partly you could see people would behave differently when they found out you're an analyst. And actually, one of the most helpful conversations I had in my career was with a policy colleague who said, he was a very candid guy. He said, the problem with you analysts is you only do two things. You tell us why something won't work, and you tell us why why something won't work, and why we've got it wrong, why our entire policy direction is wrong in a more political sense. And he said, you never actually say, this is how we could help you with your agenda. You're always telling us where we're going to fall short in our tracks. And that really struck home to me. And after hearing that, you start to see it in meetings. And I became really conscious of the number of times people would come to me, a policy colleague would come with a solution or a question, and my answer would be, well, this is why you can't do it. So I think if we're thinking about how to get analysis more involved at the center of decision making, part of it is the attitude you take. And I don't mean a rah-rah can-do attitude, but it's partly about understanding the priorities, the needs of the people who are going to be making the decisions, and the role analysis can play, rather than analysis being a stumbling block to decision making.
That's excellent. You've also given me this image of the rah-rah analyst, which I've never had before. I look forward to maybe meeting them one day. I'm interested in your, so in a sense, that's the value, that's your description of the value that analysis can, and an analytical mode of thinking can bring to decision making. I'm interested then in your assessment as to how well you think we're doing in health and social care. How well used do you think analysis is? You've given examples where the Symphony project, where you think it has been well used, but in aggregate, do you feel like decision makers make good use of analysis?
Great question. So I think this is going to be a really analytical, a typical analyst answer, but I'd say it's variable. It's variable, but overall not great. I don't think the use of analysis is great in health and care, policy making and service delivery, whatever sphere I think of. And I think there are probably two or three things. The first thing is where analysis comes in the sequence of decision making. So again, it's going to sound like a caricature, but when I was working in the Department of Health, I won't go into detail on the policy, but there was a policy proposal to extend the number of clinical professionals, or the groups of clinical professionals who could prescribe medicines. And I vividly remember a policy colleague coming to me and saying, I hear we have to do regulatory impact assessments, basically an analytical approach to the pros and cons of a policy, and my policy needs one of those. And I said, great, so what's the problem you're trying to address? What's the thing you want to solve? She said, no, don't worry, we've solved it. We know exactly what we're going to do, but I've been told I need an impact assessment to back it up and show it's a good idea, so could you do one? So there's something about the ingrained sequence, which is not how can analysis help you solve a problem or identify issues, but almost it's a checkbox we have to take. The second thing is, in terms of why analysis is not at a great place in health and care, when I think about where all the analysts cluster, and I know it's a big pool, if I think of economists, statisticians, operational researchers, they're huge clusters in the center of government. There's some regional clusters in groups like yours, which are doing excellent work, groups like the quality observatories that I thought were really underrated, the public health observatories, which did fantastic work, but again, they're clusters. And I think about where decisions are made in local trusts, in local CCGs, and there's a distance there. So I think there's a problem in analysts not being embedded enough with where decisions are being made and not being clustered, not being out there. And I think the third reason why analysis in health and care is probably not in a great place is, it sounds a bit venal, but what's the career path? What's the structure? And it's something that, if I'm being honest, it's something that's never worried me. But I've always been hovering around the center. But I run into friends who get to a certain level in their organizations and then say, I had to become a strategy officer or something more generic, a planning officer, even though I'm doing broadly the same thing, but there would never be a chief analytical officer or a director of analysis in my trust unless they were dealing with IT or something very, very technical rather than analysis in the broader sense that we'd use it.
That's excellent. So much of what you're saying rings very true. And in fact, the way we've set our unit up is actually partly a response to some of those problems, I mean, particularly the career problem, actually. I'm interested then to get you to sort of expand that out, because you start to talk about the use of the analytical workforce and the analyst workforce. Now, I accept everything you said about the career pathways, of course. In addition to that, are there other reflections that you have about how well systems make use of their analyst workforce? In the way you were describing the decision-making process, I got the sense not. But how well do you think we use the current analyst workforce?
So I've got a lot of friends who work in particularly NHS trusts and foundation trusts. And when I think about the big problems they're facing, how do you meet rising demand? How do you redesign services? What does system working mean in practice? What on earth does population health management actually mean? How's it going to change our clinical model? Whenever they feel like they need an answer to those questions, and I know this is going to sound like a caricature, the automatic reaction is, let's reach out to something that is more clearly an analytical body or can provide it. So the Big Four or a consultancy, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But there's something about having an in-house team of analytical support for the NHS which feels untapped and has value. And I'm using analysis in the broader sense. So again, one of these friends who's a senior leader in a trust, he said, one day I was doing a tour, opened a door, ran into my nuclear medicine department, who I'd never really met before. And they were all fantastic physicists. So when I talked to them about, we've got all this big data, analytical need, we're going to commission it out, they say, well, we could do that. Why don't you bring it in and we'll see what we could do. And so they've started doing population health management using part of their capability and expertise in the nuclear medicine department. So a very niche example, but it's this question of when you identify the big problems that you're trying to solve, why is it that we don't look internally to the NHS? And I think partly is, with the exception of units like yours, there is no real brand for NHS analysts. I think that's become an increasing problem.
That's really interesting. This is almost too specific a question, but it plays into what you're saying. I've often wondered about the scope that local decision makers actually have when it comes to questions of things like resource allocation. Mm-hmm. You know, big questions where you would be thinking, "Oh, crumbs, we need to get an analytical grip on that." Mm. So I also wonder, this is just me wondering out loud, whether the sort of top-down nature of the way that we construct the system and the way that decisions on things like resource allocation follow actually constrain, in a sense, the local market for analysts. Do you have any sense that that might be the case, or am I speculating too wildly?
No, so I think it is good speculation because it has a ring of truth to it. Because when you think about all the big, really crunchy analytical projects you might think of, like we've got £140 billion, how are we going to allocate that to the different parts of the UK? We need some sort of resource allocation formula. Then yes, you build this massive resource allocation team of experts in the Department of Health. But increasingly, I see an opportunity for analysis at the regional level. So a place like Oxford will sit down and do this tabula rasa event where they say, yes, we get income from all these different sources. But at some point, there is an Oxford pound. Money hits our system. And then there are constraints, but we have a lot of say over how we spend that. Now, how should we spend that to maximize our allocative efficiency, our technical efficiency, make sure we're maximizing our value for money? That is something, a research question that could benefit from an analytical approach. And at that point, who do you turn to in your system to help you answer it? So I think there are constraints, but at the same time, there's a hell of a lot of freedom, particularly at system level, to decide on these big factors where an analytical approach would help.
No, that's great. And from your use of terms like allocative and technical efficiency, I now know where you sat in the pecking order of analysts that you listed earlier. I want to I want to ask you the revolutionary question now then. So, you know, in a sense we've discussed the value that analysis can have. We've discussed its current use. We've discussed what the use of analysts looks like. So in order to improve things, you know, what is to be done? What would you do? Where would you start?
So I think I'd start, again, probably 2 or 3 things. The first one would be to network more than we do at the moment. And in all honesty, that sounds pretty rich, given this is probably the most analytical networking I've done in years. But at a time when I felt that analysis really was a key part of Department of Health policy making, was when the networks were incredibly strong. It was almost like belonging in a positive way to a cult, because all the analysts were embedded in their individual policy teams. But then there'd be a good route to come back and meet, either face-to-face or virtually, to share your expertise, share common problems. And there was a camaraderie, there was a pool, there was a support network, all those things that help the movement foster. So I think routes like this to support networking is the first key point. The second one is back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about the approach, and where, you know, not to shill for the strategy unit too much, but I can pick up one of your reports and give it to someone who's thinking about redesigning outpatient services or wants to think about why demand for A&E services is increasing. So an attitude that is, what role can analysis play in solving problems, rather so that when someone comes to you as a policy colleague with a problem, it's here's how analysis can help you answer it, rather than this is why the 3 or 4 things are going to stop it dead in its tracks. So networking, the attitude you take, the approach you take. I suppose that the other thing is, as with a lot of revolutions, recognizing that this will be a long-term thing. This is going to be a terrible analogy, but so I'm a comic book fan, of course. Cliche, an analyst who's a comic book fan. If you told me 20 years ago that comic book movies would be such an established part of the cultural zeitgeist, I would have laughed. It would always be a niche. And what changed was not one big moment, but a slow, steady accretion of different things. So I think if we take the opportunities that are particularly present now during system working, where people will be given a lot of accountability, a lot of responsibility for how decisions are made, and there's a particular class of decisions where an analytical approach can help, that will be the start of a long-term trend that really embeds analysis at the heart of decision making.
I just want to pull out one of the points that I think was inherent in what you were just saying, which is about the sort of ways of working in the current moment. So the analytical community that I observe in the response to COVID has, you know, networked very quickly, is sharing code, you know, our code, is sharing data, is sharing models, is critiquing, is behaving in a very open source sort of way. IG problems seem to be dissolving. Are there things that have occurred in the current moment that you would want to retain or even accelerate?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a great point. I think probably the 2 things I'd like to retain are the multidisciplinary approaches that have been taken to all of this. You know, I've done more work with epidemiologists and operational researchers than I can ever remember in my career. And so I think the silos between professions are breaking down, and that sort of overlapping Venn diagram of there's some core analytical skills, a way of thinking through problems, and then obviously you have your specialisms around that. But that's one thing I'd like to retain. And the other thing is just the breakdown in organizational boundaries. I mean, there's always just a slight competitive tension, which can be healthy, over what organization is going to lead on this analytical issue, who owns commentary and analysis on A&E performance. All of that has just gone, has fizzled away, where people say, I'll take that one, you take that one, we'll share staff moving across. So I'm not saying that organizations need to end, but it's back to that networking point of, I feel much more connected across different professions, across different organizations than I have before, partly through the new relationships that you've had to form, but partly because you're facing a common problem, and that's a very specific common problem at the moment with COVID, but it could as easily be how you maximize value for money for investment in health and care services, or how you reform social care financing. So this common problem that unites people, I think, is something to hold on to.
No, that's excellent. Listen, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you ever so much for your thoughts, and I'm sure that the participants at the Analyst Revolution event will also gain much from your reflections. So thank you ever so much.
Likewise, thanks, Fraser.